Alright guys, welcome to the third video in the FVega.blog tutorial series working with Hyper-V. And in this video we're going to go through some of the configuration options that I like to set up whenever I create a new virtual machine. And we'll do that on the previous virtual machine that we created in the last video there. So I will right click on this Windows 10 Pro machine. Again, this is the one we created in the previous video. And I'll go to settings, and here you can see we've got a whole slew of options here to choose from, and I'm actually gonna choose to start in the management section. This is typically settings that I tend to, anytime I create a new virtual machine, I tend to apply the same settings to them, one of which is guest services, right? It's initially turned off or not activated right away, but you'll want to make sure that you check guest services simply because there's a couple of different things that guest services includes, and I'm not familiar with them off the top of my head, but you can certainly I'll post a link to that more information to the guest services. But the single most important one that you'll regret not having is the copy and paste. It sounds so trivial, but the copy and paste functionality from your host machine to your virtual machine, absolutely imperative that you have that. Trust me. If you don't want to do it, that's fine, but I'm willing to bet in a short amount of time you'll want to have it on there. So go ahead and relieve yourself from any potential pain. Click on guest services, get that installed. Checkpoints, I typically leave my checkpoints disabled. Simply because of the fact I mean I never really even used them, to be honest with you. I don't want the way I assume they work, and you'll probably want to fact check this, but the way I assume it works is that it's kind of like system restore in a regular Windows environment, and it goes and creates various restore points along the way. For a virtual machine, typically I don't care too much about them to waste the disk space to create restore points. However, you may want to, once you get your virtual machine set up and an operating system loaded onto it, and after you get into that operating system, maybe you have a bunch of configuration changes that you need to make, and then also you want to get all your applications and your programs installed on that operating system, and that can take a fair amount of work to do. So I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to have checkpoints enabled, to be able to save at least that state, because at some point down the road you're probably going to F something up in a virtual machine, and you're going to wish you could go back, and that's where the value of checkpoints comes in. So I do believe you can disable it, and then later on down the road, if you decide you want to turn it on, you can do that. So I mean, it's up to you what you want to do there. But like I say, for my purposes, checkpoints are not really necessary, as everything I do in my virtuals is usually just throwaway stuff anyway. So that's that. And then automatic start. I think this is default. I think it's set to automatically start whenever your host machine starts up. I do not like that at all. I could be wrong about this, but if I've got 5 or 6 different virtual machines configured here, and they're all set to start when my host runs, it sounds to me like that's like if each one of them has a gig, I'm out 5 or 6 gigs as soon as my machine starts, 5 or 6 gigs of RAM. I don't know if that's exactly how it works, but there's really hardly ever a need, at least in my situations, where I need my virtual machine to run right away. You may have a different need. If you do, then by all means, you can set it up to automatically start, or you can even set a delay on it, which is pretty neat. But like I say, I usually don't want my virtuals to start as soon as I start my host machine, so I set that to nothing. And then the automatic stop action here I think is the last one we'll touch on here in the management section. This can save the day, or it could be very useless to most people. But the key and the nice thing about this here is, if you have your virtual machine up and running, and you have some important stuff that maybe you wanted to save or were working on, but then something happens where your host machine, you forget about it, and maybe you go off to a different screen and you shut down your actual host machine or your actual physical computer. There's an option here where you can have Hyper-V save the state of the virtual machine. Before it shuts off or goes through the shutdown process on your regular machine, it'll take a snapshot of its current state, and that way you won't lose anything, which is cool. Also, you can have it do a shutdown, just a clean shutdown of the operating system, as opposed to turning it off, which is basically just pulling the plug on the machine and just cutting it off. Simple as that. I like the save the state. I think it certainly saved my butt at least once or twice. Like I said, but I usually don't run anything on my virtual machine, or I don't do anything on my virtual machine that's not just throwaway stuff anyways. There's usually nothing too important on there. So I'm going to go ahead and use the shutdown. I like a nice graceful shutdown just for the sake of it anyways. So we'll go ahead and we'll save it as that. And that pretty much covers up the management section. Let me just go ahead and apply those settings quick. There we go. And then we'll go to the fun stuff, the hardware, right? Just like physical computers, need certain things to run. Well, so does a virtual machine. The only difference is, instead of a virtual machine having a processor or having memory or any of those things, you're sharing what's on your machine, right, on your physical box. So we can go ahead and we can add various different options here. The network adapter would probably be one that you would want to use, but it gets created for you anyways when you create the machine, so there's no need to do that. There's some other things here which, for the sake of it in this tutorial, I won't go into every one of them, but you can certainly research these other pieces and see if you need to implement them in your use case or for your scenario. The BIOS order, the boot order for your operating system or for your machine, is it going to go from the CD, IDE, whatever. You can set that order just like you would or like you could if you were on a physical machine. So that's nice. The security settings, it looks like, well, if you want to do some fancy security, I've never touched this, never even looked at it. I think in a Generation 2 machine, you could do secure boot, which I'm assuming is probably the same thing. I have it turned off, and let's just say I'm still alive and still kicking, so it must not be that important for me. You can obviously click on that if you want to learn more about it. The memory, you remember I kind of went into a little bit of a detail in one of the previous videos about memory and how important it is to kind of keep that shit in check, so to speak. And that is where this section comes in. Enable dynamic memory. Yes, sure, it's really great. It's awesome. You can allow the amount of memory available to this virtual machine to change dynamically within the range you set, right? Cool. But look at what the max value is set to. Way, 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 way too high, right? I've got this thing set up for 1 gig of RAM. And the dynamic memory is set up here to a minimum of 512 megs, which is fair for most. I think the Windows minimum amount of RAM you need is about 512. But then the maximum RAM, if you're doing some stuff on a virtual machine, who knows what could happen. Like I say, most of my virtual machines are just playgrounds, or the things that I use virtual machines for are just playgrounds. You might have some specific needs, but I would certainly recommend either turning off dynamic memory and making sure that you just allot enough memory for your virtual to run, or if you're going to turn on dynamic memory, make sure you come in here and lower that a bit. I could never see a case where just any virtual machine would ever need more than 2, 3, maybe 4 gigs of RAM max. So I would probably drop it down to that, but for this case, I'm just going to shut off dynamic memory. I'm just going to up this to 1240. Oh, no, I'm not. Oh, I've got my num lock. There we go. Sorry, I had my num lock turned off. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and set it to 2 gigs because that'll be fairly sufficient for my purposes on this machine. And let's see, this setting, yeah, you can tweak this to your heart's desire. It looks like it's just gonna basically allow you to determine which either which of your virtual machines or which of your host machine gets the priority. And that's just skimming. I didn't actually read it. Whatever. Moving on. The number of processors also important. If you have a multi-core processor on your host machine, and you want to give an extra core, to the virtual, feel free and do it. If you want to set some limits on how much of the actual processor and resources it can use, you can do that here. I just leave everything default because for the most part, like I say, I don't really do too much with the with these machines anyways to make it ever cause any issues for me. So you can go in there and you can tweak some of these other settings as well if you need. We'll move past it. The hard drive, we've already set that up, but just in case you want to do some other things, like say you have a physical hard drive, in your actual computer. Maybe you've got 3 or 4 different bays of hard drives, and you want to map this virtual machine to one of those. You could do that. Otherwise, you could set up a SCSI controller or map it to a regular IDE controller. So you can do that with these settings. We'll just leave that default. And let me see here. I'm sorry, there's 2 drives. One of them is for the DVD drive, and then the other one is for the hard drive, these IDE controllers, which are cool. I don't have any SCSI hard drive or SCSI controllers set up, but you could do that if you wanted to. And then, most importantly, the last bit is the network adapter. With the network adapter, obviously you're going to want to be able to connect to the internet. I'm going to save that for another video from when we actually have an operating system. When we go through that installation process, I'm going to show you how to set up a virtual switch that you can use as your network adapter for your virtual. So yeah, cool. We're going to go ahead and move forward then. As always, leave any questions, comments, and concerns. Go ahead and hit apply quick. Go ahead and leave any questions, comments, concerns in the comments section. And in the next video, like I said, we're going to go ahead and get this sucker fired up with Windows 10. We're going to load that operating system, and you're going to love it. So be sure to like the video, of course, and subscribe to the channel so you can get all of the latest content that we put up here. So thanks.